Far below the surface of the sea, where sunlight softened into green and blue, and the water held its own cathedral-like silence, there stood the kingdom of the Sea King. Coral halls rose like carved stone, sea flowers swayed in hidden gardens, and the currents moved through everything with a dreamlike grace. There lived the Little Mermaid, the youngest of the king's daughters, quiet, thoughtful, and unlike the others in the depth of her longing. While her sisters delighted in tales of shipwrecks, treasures, and storms, she listened most carefully whenever the world above the sea was spoken of. Her grandmother told her that beyond the sea lay another world, where human beings walked upon the earth, lit fires against the night, and lived lives brief but full of mystery. These stories stirred the Little Mermaid more deeply than she could explain, yet she was too young to rise to the surface herself. Each mermaid princess had to wait until her 15th year before she could first visit the upper world, and so the youngest listened, imagined, and waited. In the stillness of the deep, her longing grew not louder but more faithful, as certain desires do when they are denied for too long. At last the night came when she was allowed to rise. She swam upward through dark water silvered by moonlight until her head broke the surface, and the human world opened before her. The sky seemed vast beyond measure. The stars burned with a strange stillness, and near her floated a great ship, lit with lanterns and music. On its deck people moved in celebration, and among them stood a young prince, handsome, grave, and alive in a way that struck her heart with sudden force. It was his birthday, though she did not yet know it. She knew only that she could not look away. But joy on the sea is often fragile. Before long the sky darkened, the wind rose, and the celebration gave way to terror. Waves struck the ship, masts groaned, lightning tore the heavens apart. The Little Mermaid watched the prince as the vessel broke under the storm's violence, and men were thrown into the black water. Without hesitation, she swam to him. His strength was fading, his eyes had closed, and there, amid wreckage and foaming darkness, she held his head above the waves and carried him through the long, perilous night toward the shore. By dawn, she had brought him safely to land. Bells sounded from a nearby convent, and the first rose-colored light touched the shore. The Little Mermaid placed the prince gently upon the sand and hid herself behind the rocks, watching with all the tenderness of a heart that had already given itself away. Soon a young woman from the convent found him, and people came to carry him to safety. The prince opened his eyes and smiled at the woman before him, never knowing who had saved his life. The Little Mermaid felt both joy and sorrow in the same breath. Back in the Sea Kingdom, she could no longer rest. It was not only the prince she desired now, but the world to which he belonged. She learned from her grandmother that humans, though their lives are brief, possess immortal souls that rise beyond death. Mermaids, by contrast, live long and beautiful lives beneath the sea, only to dissolve at last into foam. This knowledge pierced the Little Mermaid more deeply than fear. She longed not merely for love, but for a soul, for a place in the mystery that seemed to burn within the human world above. At last she sought the Sea Witch, who lived in a part of the ocean feared even by the bravest creatures of the deep. The path there wound through dark waters, grasping plants, and strange pale things that moved without sound. The witch understood her desire before it was spoken. Yes, she could give the mermaid human legs. Yes, the prince might come to love her, but every wish has its price. The potion would cause terrible pain. Her voice, the sweetest thing she possessed, must be surrendered. And if the prince married another, her heart would break, and she would vanish into sea foam. The little mermaid did not turn back. Love and longing had already carried her too far. She gave the witch her voice, and with it the songs of her childhood, the language of her sorrow, and the one power by which she might have moved the prince's heart. Carrying the potion, she rose through the night to the shore near his palace. There, at dawn, she drank. Pain rushed through her as if a sword had passed through her body. She fell senseless. When she awoke, she had human legs, beautiful and graceful, but every step she took would feel as though she were walking upon knives. The prince found her on the shore, silent, radiant, and strange. He brought her into the palace with curiosity and kindness, delighted by her beauty and by the gentle sadness in her eyes. She could dance with a grace no one had ever seen, though each movement cost her pain. She remained near him always, loving him more deeply than she had ever loved the sea itself. And yet, because she had no voice, she could not tell him who she was, or how his life had once rested in her arms between storm and dawn. The prince loved the silent girl dearly, but not as she hoped. He said she was as precious to him as a beloved child, as gentle and faithful as a spirit sent to comfort him. But the one he believed had saved him from the sea was the young woman from the convent, the first face he had seen when he awoke on shore. In his mind, gratitude and longing had already shaped a false memory. The little mermaid, unable to speak, could not correct it, and so she listened while the man she loved gave his heart to an illusion she herself had made possible. In time, the prince was told that he would marry a neighboring princess, and when he met her, he believed she was the very one who had saved him. Joy lit his face with the certainty the little mermaid had long feared. Preparations were made at once. The wedding would take place, and afterward the ship would carry them over the sea beneath festive banners and music. The little mermaid remained beside him through it all, smiling when he looked at her, while within her the knowledge of her fate darkened hour by hour like evening falling across water. On the night after the wedding, when all was quiet but for the breathing of the sea and the dim creak of the ship, the little mermaid's sisters rose from the water beside her. Their long hair was gone. They had given it to the sea witch in exchange for one last chance to save her. They placed a knife in her hand and told her that if she struck the prince before dawn and let his blood fall upon her feet, she would become a mermaid again and return with them to the sea. The little mermaid took the knife and stood trembling in the moonlight. She entered the cabin and looked upon the prince as he slept beside his bride. One movement, one terrible act, and her life would be restored. The sea would take her back. Her sisters would not lose her. Yet love, in its purest and saddest form, does not destroy the beloved for the sake of survival. The little mermaid bent down and kissed the prince's brow one final time. Then she threw the knife into the sea. The blade flashed briefly, vanished beneath the waves, and with it vanished her last claim upon the earthly life she had chosen. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the little mermaid stepped to the ship's edge and cast herself into the sea. She expected pain. She expected dissolution. She expected to become foam upon the water, as all mermaids must at the end. But death did not take her in the way she had feared. Instead, she felt herself lifted into brightness, weightless, as the morning air. Around her moved beings of light, the daughters of the air, who told her that because she had chosen mercy over selfishness, she had been granted another path toward an immortal soul. No longer of the sea, not yet of heaven, she had become a daughter of the air. Through kindness, patience, and unseen good deeds, she might still one day gain the eternal life for which she had yearned. It was not the ending she had imagined when she first rose to the surface and saw the prince beneath the lanterns. It was not a human wedding, nor a triumph of earthly love. Yet it was not nothing. It was a strange and sorrowful grace, the kind Andersen so often offers, an ending that wounds the heart while opening it towards something larger. That is why The Little Mermaid has endured for generations. It is not merely a tale of longing, nor only a story of sacrifice. It is a meditation on love, pain, silence, and the cost of desiring another world. The Little Mermaid does not win in the ordinary sense. She loses voice, home, and the human love she sought. Yet through that loss, she becomes more than she was. Andersen does not comfort us cheaply. He gives us instead a beauty touched by grief and a hope so fragile that it feels almost holy above the breaking waves. There were once 25 tin soldiers, all cast from the same old spoon and placed together in a box. They were identical in every detail, except one. Because there had not been quite enough metal at the end, the last soldier had only one leg, yet he stood as firmly as any of the others, straight-backed and silent, with the grave courage of one who has no choice but to remain upright. Before them on the nursery table stood a paper castle, and within it a delicate dancer balanced on one leg. Seeing her there, the little tin soldier believed he had found another soul who knew how to endure beautifully. The paper dancer was cut so lightly and painted so delicately that she seemed almost made of breath and moonlight. One arm was raised, one leg hidden behind her skirts, and from where the soldier stood, she appeared to balance on a single leg exactly as he did. He said nothing, of course. Tin soldiers are not given to speeches, but his gaze remained fixed upon her through the evening, loyal and astonished. In the quiet world of toys, where shadows lengthened across the room and candlelight flickered gently, a small and solemn affection had already taken root. Not far from the paper castle stood a black snuff-box, and from within it there lived a little goblin with sharp eyes and a sour temper. He noticed at once where the soldier's attention rested, and the sight displeased him greatly. That night, when the nursery had gone dark and all sensible creatures ought to have slept, the goblin sprang from the box and hissed at the tin soldier to keep his eyes to himself. But the soldier did not answer. He had not moved all day, and he would not move now. Some forms of courage are loud, others are simply the refusal to turn away. The next day, whether by mischief, chance, or the goblin's silent revenge, the one-legged soldier found himself placed upon the window-sill. Below lay the street, deep and uncertain. A sudden gust blew through the room, the window flew open wider, and the tin soldier fell headfirst into the world outside. He struck the pavement below and remained standing on his single leg between the stones, his musket still in his hand. Rain clouds gathered overhead, wheels rolled past, feet hurried by. Yet even in that strange and hostile new world he did not collapse. He stood where he had fallen, as brave things often must. Soon 2 boys found him in the street. Delighted by the discovery, they folded a paper boat, placed the soldier inside it, and sent him sailing down the rushing gutter water. What had begun as a nursery table romance became, in an instant, a dangerous voyage. The paper walls shook beneath him. The water surged dark and fast. Rain fell harder. The little soldier stood in the center of the fragile craft, grave and motionless, while the city washed past in blurred reflections. He did not cry out. Whether from discipline, dignity, or helplessness, he faced the current as he had faced everything else, without complaint. The gutter narrowed and rushed toward a drain so black and deep that it seemed like the mouth of the earth itself. The soldier could hear the roaring water before he saw the opening. The paper boat spun, dipped, and was pulled forward with terrible speed. Any lesser passenger might have panicked, but the little tin soldier remained upright, though the water climbed around him, and the boat began to soften under the strain. When it reached the drain, darkness swallowed him whole. He passed from rain and daylight into echoing tunnels, borne onward by a force no courage could resist. In the blackness beneath the street, a great water rat appeared and demanded to know whether the soldier had a passport and had paid the toll. The rat chattered angrily and bared its teeth, but the soldier gave no answer. He could not, and perhaps he would not. The current pulled him past while the rat pursued along the stones, shrieking after him in fury. It was a grotesque little parody of the world above, where officials, papers, and permissions so often trouble the helpless. Yet the soldier passed beyond even that mockery, carried toward a fate more final than bureaucracy. At last the paper boat, soaked through and trembling on the edge of ruin, gave way entirely. It folded around the little soldier and sank. Water closed over his head. The current rolled him downward into the dark. For a moment he vanished completely, as though the story had no intention of returning him to light. Yet even then, Andersen does not let us forget his strange nobility. The soldier sinks not with drama, but with composure, like a small emblem of fidelity, descending into a world that has never promised to reward it. Then, in one absurd and sudden turn worthy of fairy tales alone, a great fish swallowed him whole. Inside the creature's dark belly, the soldier lay in silence, more cut off from the world than ever before. Time passed strangely there. He could see nothing, hear only the muffled movements of water and flesh, and yet he continued to exist, still intact, still holding his musket, still in some impossible way, maintaining the dignity with which he had first stood in the toy box. It is one of Andersen's peculiar gifts that he can make even such grotesque misfortune feel touched by pathos. At last the fish was caught, sold in the market, and brought into a kitchen where it was laid upon a table and cut open. To everyone's astonishment, the little tin soldier tumbled out into the light. And wonder of wonders, he had returned to the very same house from which he had fallen. The room was familiar, the table was the same, the paper castle still stood, and there, just as before, was the dancer. The soldier said nothing, of course, yet the whole journey seemed to gather itself into that one impossible return, as if fate had circled back for reasons still unreadable. He stood once more upon the nursery table, facing the paper dancer whose image had accompanied him through storm, darkness, tunnels, and the belly of a fish. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had changed. He had crossed the world and returned, but still he could not step closer, and still she remained poised in her castle like a fragile promise. If there was recognition between them, it passed in silence. Their whole story had always lived in silence. That, perhaps, is what makes it so moving. Some of the deepest attachments in fairy tales are never spoken aloud. Then, without warning or reason, the child took the tin soldier and threw him into the fire. Why? Andersen does not explain. In his tales, fate is often as arbitrary as it is merciless. The soldier landed among the flames, where the heat surrounded him at once. He looked toward the paper dancer. She looked toward him. A door flew open somewhere, and a draft of wind caught her. Like a white leaf or a final thought, she drifted from the paper castle straight into the fire beside him. There, at last, the distance between them was gone. The flames curled around tin and paper alike. The dancer blackened and vanished almost at once, while the soldier glowed red with heat, still holding his form as long as he could. It is a cruel ending, yet also a strangely tender one. What life had denied them in nearness, destruction granted in a final and terrible union. No vows were exchanged, no promises spoken, no future opened before them. There was only fire, and within it the completion of something quiet, faithful, and doomed from the very beginning. When the maid cleaned the hearth the next morning, she found among the ashes a small piece of tin in the shape of a heart. Beside it lay the dancer's burnt spangle, black as coal. That was all. Yet it was enough. The entire tale seemed somehow gathered into those two remains. Steadfastness melted into love, fragility reduced to a dark little star. Andersen rarely softens sorrow, but he knows how to leave behind an image that keeps sorrow luminous. The heart in the ashes is one such image, small enough to miss, powerful enough never to forget. The steadfast tin soldier is not a tale of victory. The soldier is not rewarded with life, marriage, or peace. He endures, returns, and is destroyed. Yet the story does not feel empty. It feels tragic in the old fairy tale sense, where value lies not in success, but in the manner of one's bearing. The little soldier never complains, never betrays his devotion, never abandons his posture of dignity. That is what makes him steadfast, and that is why his fate, though sorrowful, carries a kind of nobility that lingers long after the story ends. So the one-legged tin soldier passes from toy to symbol, from nursery object to one of Andersen's quiet, tragic heroes. His story moves through absurdity, danger, tenderness, and fire. But at its center remains a simple, unwavering truth. Fidelity may not save us, and yet it may still define us. In that sense, the tale belongs among Andersen's saddest and most beautiful works. It asks for no laughter and offers no easy comfort. Instead, it leaves us with a tiny heart in the ashes, and with the memory of a figure who stood upright through every storm. Long ago, in a wealthy city of narrow streets and echoing bells, there ruled a king whose greatest passion was not justice, nor wisdom, nor the welfare of his people, but clothes. He loved velvet cloaks, jeweled collars, silken gloves, and robes embroidered with gold so much that each hour of the day seemed to require a different costume. While other rulers inspected armies or studied matters of state, this king lingered in dressing rooms lined with mirrors, asking how each sleeve fell, how each hem moved, and how splendid he appeared beneath candlelight. The whole court learned to orbit this strange obsession. Ministers praised fabrics they did not understand. Servants carried garments as if transporting sacred relics. Courtiers bowed not only to the king, but to the shimmer of his sleeves and the cut of his coat. In that palace, appearances became a kind of law. No one wished to seem dull, unfashionable, or out of step with royal taste. And so, little by little, the habit of honesty grew weak, while the habit of flattering whatever stood before them grew strong. One autumn evening, when the wind had begun to turn colder and the sky hung low over the city, two strangers arrived at the gates. They called themselves master weavers. Their words were smooth, their bows graceful, and their eyes always measuring the room before they spoke. They claimed to know a craft unlike any other in the world. They could weave cloth of such extraordinary beauty, they said, that its colors would shimmer like dreamlight. But that was not its most remarkable quality. The cloth, they whispered, would remain invisible to anyone hopelessly stupid or unfit for office. Now this promise enchanted the king more deeply than any jewel ever had. What finer garment could there be than one that not only made him appear magnificent, but also revealed the fools in his kingdom? With such cloth, he thought, he could distinguish the wise from the witless, the capable from the unworthy. Vanity and suspicion joined hands in his mind. At once he ordered the strangers to be given rooms, looms, gold thread, fine silk, and every comfort needed for their work. The weavers bowed low, thanked him humbly, and began their performance. In the workshop prepared for them, the two swindlers set up their looms and sat down with great seriousness. They moved their hands back and forth, lifted nothing, measured nothing, cut nothing, and yet behaved as though they were handling the most delicate fabric ever made. They demanded more silk. They requested more gold thread. Every bundle brought to them disappeared into hidden bags and locked chests, while the looms remained utterly bare. Still the men worked late into the night, speaking in the language of craft and beauty, confident that no one would dare confess what could not be seen. At last, the king grew impatient to know how the marvelous cloth was progressing, yet he hesitated to go himself. Instead, he sent his oldest and most trusted minister, a man long respected for wisdom and caution. The old minister walked to the workshop with slow, careful steps, telling himself there was nothing to fear. Surely he would admire the cloth, report its beauty, and return with dignity intact. But when he entered the room and looked upon the looms, his heart sank. He saw nothing at all. The old minister blinked, stepped closer, and peered again. Still there was nothing, not the faintest thread, not the slightest gleam. A terrible thought crept through him. Was he a fool? Was he unfit for office after all these years? He dared not test the truth aloud. So when the swindlers asked whether he admired the pattern and the colors, he forced a smile onto his pale face. He praised the elegance of what he could not see, memorized details that did not exist, and returned to the palace carrying not cloth, but fear. Before the king, the old minister bowed and described the cloth in elaborate terms. He spoke of subtle colors, graceful patterns, and workmanship too refined for ordinary speech. The king listened with growing delight. If the minister had seen it, then the cloth must be real. Yet beneath that delight lived another thought, cold and quiet. If ever the king himself failed to see it, what would that say about him? Even in triumph, the trap had already begun to close. And still, because no one wished to step outside the lie became stronger. To make certain, the king sent another official, younger and eager to rise. He too entered the workshop with confidence, and he too found only emptiness stretched across the frames of the looms. But ambition can be just as fearful as age. The young official did not dare lose his place by speaking plainly, so he admired what he could not see, nodding eagerly while the swindlers described invented designs. When he returned, His praise was even more extravagant than the minister's. Thus falsehood passed from one frightened heart to another, until it sounded almost like truth. At last the king could wait no longer. Surrounded by chosen courtiers and wrapped in ceremonial dignity, he went himself to see the wonder that was being prepared for him. The swindlers bowed deeply and gestured toward the looms with theatrical pride. The king looked, then looked again. Nothing lay there. The emptiness struck him like a blow. For one trembling instant, all his certainty deserted him. Could it be that he, the king, was unfit to rule? The thought was too shameful to endure. So he smiled, praised the cloth, and told the weavers it was exquisite. Once the king had spoken, the rest followed easily. Every courtier leaned forward to admire the empty air. Each repeated what others had already said, adding more detail, more wonder, more certainty. The room filled with admiration for a garment that did not exist. The swindlers received medals, titles, and richer gifts. The king commanded that the new clothes be finished in time for a great procession through the city. Outside, rumor spread quickly. Soon the whole kingdom had heard of the miraculous fabric that only the wise and worthy could see. On the night before the procession, the swindlers remained awake with candles burning low around them. They snipped the air with great shears. They stitched with needles threaded by nothing at all. They held up invisible sleeves, folded invisible collars, and called for attendants to help them move the delicate fabric. Those who watched saw only gestures and shadow, but no one dared speak the obvious. By now, the deceit no longer belonged to the swindlers alone. It had been adopted, protected, and fed by every fearful person who stood nearby. Morning came, and the king entered the dressing chamber to be clothed in his new magnificence. The swindlers lifted their empty arms and said they were presenting the trousers, the coat, the mantle. They fastened nothing around him, arranged nothing upon him, yet stepped back with solemn satisfaction. The king turned before the mirror and saw only his own exposed body adorned by pride and terror. Still he nodded. Still he asked whether the clothes sat well. And all around him the courtiers whispered that the fit was perfect, the cut masterful, the elegance beyond compare. Then the doors of the palace were opened, and the king stepped out into the public street, beneath banners, bells, and a dim morning sky. Behind him walked attendants, bending low, as if lifting a long train that was not there. The crowd had gathered in dense silence. Men and women craned their necks. Parents raised children to see. Yet they all knew the story of the cloth, and each person feared the judgment hidden within it. So one voice praised the sleeves, another admired the colors, and soon the entire street echoed with borrowed wonder. But admiration born of fear has a strange, brittle sound. Smiles looked strained. Applause rose too quickly and died too soon. Many in the crowd felt unease crawling beneath their praise. They saw what was plain before their eyes, yet they were surrounded by voices insisting on the opposite. So they clung to the safety of repetition. Better to say what everyone else was saying than risk being called a fool. And thus the king moved onward through a city not merely deceived, but trapped by its own cowardice. Then, from among the people, there came a voice too young to understand the rules of fear. A child, lifted above the crowd, looked straight at the king and said in simple astonishment, "But he has nothing on." For a moment, the street seemed to stop breathing. The words were small, almost light. yet they cut through the fog of pretended admiration more sharply than any accusation from court or council could have done. Truth, when spoken plainly, does not need ornament. It only needs a voice willing to utter it. At first, there was only whispering. Then the whisper passed from one person to the next, like wind moving through dry leaves. "He has nothing on," they repeated. Nothing on at all. The king heard it. He knew at once that the child was right, and that all the city now knew it too. Shame burned through him, cold and fierce. Yet because pride is often strongest at the moment it has been most deeply wounded, he lifted his head and continued the procession. Behind him, the attendants still bent low, pretending to carry the invisible train. And so the procession ended, not in triumph, but in exposure. The swindlers were gone, carrying with them the silk, the gold, and the reward of a kingdom too afraid to speak plainly. The court remained, the city remained, and the king remained as well, though not unchanged. For once falsehood has been spoken by everyone, truth sounds both humiliating and merciful when it finally arrives. That is why Andersen's tale lingers in the dark corners of the heart. It is not only about a foolish ruler, it is about the silence that vanity creates and the strange courage it takes to say what all eyes can see. There was once a woman who longed for a child of her own, though no child had come to her house. At last she went to a wise old woman and asked if there was any way such a wish might be granted. The old woman gave her a single barley corn and told her to plant it carefully. It was not the sort of grain that grows in ordinary fields. The woman placed it in a flower pot by the window, watered it, and waited. Soon a strange bud rose from the soil, closed as tightly as if it held a secret. When the flower opened, the woman bent close and gasped. Inside the petals sat a tiny girl, no longer than a thumb, delicate and bright as a drop of morning light. The woman named her Thumbelina. A walnut shell became her cradle, blue-violet petals her mattress, and a rose leaf her blanket. By day, she sailed in a plate of water on a tulip petal, guiding herself with 2 white horsehairs for oars. She was so small that the whole cottage seemed like a kingdom, and the woman's lonely heart filled with wonder. One warm night, while Thumbelina slept in her walnut shell, an old toad hopped through the open window. The toad saw the tiny girl and thought she would make a fine bride for her clumsy son. Without asking, without pity, she lifted the cradle and carried Thumbelina away through the dark garden. By morning, the child woke on a broad water lily leaf in the middle of a stream. Around her, the bank seemed impossibly far away. The old toad and her son croaked about wedding plans, while Thumbelina sat trembling among the green leaves. The little fish beneath the water heard Thumbelina crying. They looked up through the clear stream and saw how unhappy she was. No creature so gentle, they thought, should be forced to marry a muddy toad in a dark bank. Together they nibbled at the stem of the lily leaf until it broke free. The current caught the leaf and carried Thumbelina away. The toads shouted from the shore, but they could not follow. Thumbelina drifted beneath the sky, frightened but free, while dragonflies shone like living jewels above the water. A cockchafer beetle saw Thumbelina floating by and thought she was the prettiest little creature he had ever seen. He caught her in his claws and flew up into a tree. At first he admired her and brought her honey from the flowers, but when other beetles gathered around, they wrinkled their feelers and said she was strange. She had only 2 legs, no wings, and no proper beetle shape at all. Their laughter made the cockchafer ashamed of his own delight. Soon he carried Thumbelina down and left her alone in the grass. All summer, Thumbelina lived by herself in the meadow. She wove a little bed from blades of grass, drank dew from leaves, and listened to birds singing high above her. In sunlight, the world seemed kind, and flowers gave her shelter. But as autumn came, the leaves yellowed and fell, the birds flew away, rain soaked the ground, and the wind grew sharp. Thumbelina's tiny hands trembled with cold. She had no house, no fire, and no one to call her own. When winter approached, the beautiful meadow became a place of hunger and fear. At last, nearly frozen, Thumbelina found a little door in the stubble field. It belonged to an old field mouse who lived warm and tidy beneath the earth with a storeroom of grain. Thumbelina asked for a crumb of food, and the mouse took pity on her. She allowed the child to stay through winter in exchange for keeping the room clean and telling stories. Thumbelina was grateful for warmth, but the underground house had low ceilings and no sky. Still, she swept carefully, told gentle tales, and tried not to think too often of sunlight. The field mouse had a neighbor, a wealthy mole who wore a fine black velvet coat and disliked the sun. He knew many things about tunnels, roots, and stored food, and the field mouse considered him an excellent match. When he visited, Thumbelina sang for him in her small, clear voice. The mole praised her, though he said birds were foolish creatures because they sang in summer and starved in winter. Thumbelina said nothing, but her heart tightened. The mouse began to speak of marriage, security, and a comfortable future underground. Thumbelina listened politely, feeling the sky slipping farther away. One day, the mole showed them a long tunnel between his house and the field mouse's. In the passage lay a swallow, still and cold, with folded wings. The mole declared it dead and spoke scornfully of birds who waste their lives in flight and song. But Thumbelina felt sorrow for the poor creature. That night, when the others slept, she crept back with a blanket of dry grass. She laid it over the swallow and pressed her cheek against its feathers. Then she heard the faintest heartbeat. The bird was not dead. It was only frozen and weak. All winter, Thumbelina cared for the swallow in secret. She brought water in a flower petal, crumbs from the field mouse's table, and soft grass to keep him warm. Slowly his strength returned. He told her of blue skies, warm countries, white marble palaces, and orange trees shining in the sun. Thumbelina listened, as if he were describing a dream she had once known. When spring came, the swallow stretched his wings and prepared to fly. He asked Thumbelina to come with him, but she would not leave without thanking the field mouse who had saved her from the cold. Spring brightened the world above, but Thumbelina remained underground. The field mouse was busy preparing her wedding to the mole. She spoke of velvet rooms, full pantries, and a husband of importance. Thumbelina tried to be obedient, yet every word felt like a stone placed over her heart. The mole was not cruel, but he loved darkness and silence, and he would never allow her to see the sun. Her wedding clothes were made, her future praised, and the date set for autumn. Thumbelina grew quieter each day, longing for the open air. On the morning before the wedding, Thumbelina asked permission to go outside and say farewell to the sun. The field mouse allowed it, thinking such fancies harmless. Thumbelina climbed through the doorway and stood among the stubble. Above her stretched the wide blue sky, endless and bright. Warmth touched her face, and tears filled her eyes. She said goodbye to the sun, the grass, and the singing world she believed she must lose forever. Then a familiar shadow swept over the field. The swallow had returned, circling low with a cry of joy. The swallow begged Thumbelina to come with him now, before the earth closed over her life. This time she did not refuse. She climbed onto his back and tied herself gently with a ribbon. Up they rose, over fields, forests, rivers, and mountains. The wind rushed around her, but she was not afraid. Below, the world spread wide and beautiful, and the dark tunnels of the mole vanished behind them. They flew toward warm countries where winter could not reach so easily, and Thumbelina felt, for the first time, that smallness did not mean helplessness. At last, the swallow carried her to a land of sunlight, white marble columns, and flowers taller than trees. He set her gently in the heart of a great blossom. There Thumbelina saw a tiny prince, no taller than herself, with clear eyes and delicate wings. Around him lived a whole people of flower spirits, graceful and kind. They were astonished by Thumbelina's beauty and by the long journey she had survived. The prince asked if she would stay among them, not as a prisoner or possession, but as someone free to choose her own happiness. Thumbelina's heart answered before her words did. She had been carried away, judged, hidden, sheltered, and nearly buried beneath another life. Here, at last, she was asked. She accepted the prince's friendship and love, and the flower people brought her a pair of clear wings, light as dragonfly glass. When they fastened them to her shoulders, she rose above the petals with wonder. She was no longer only the tiny girl in a walnut shell. She had crossed water, winter, darkness, and fear, and had found a place where her small voice mattered. The swallow stayed for a while among the warm flowers, but when the season changed, he knew he must fly back north. Thumbelina thanked him with all her heart. Without his kindness, she might have vanished into a life without sunlight. The swallow promised to carry her story wherever he flew, the tale of a tiny child who endured the wide world's dangers and found freedom not by becoming large, but by remaining brave. Then he rose into the blue air, while Thumbelina, winged and joyful among the blossoms, began a life chosen by her own heart. There was once a merchant who had been prosperous enough to fill his house with comfort, servants, and expectation. But fortune has a habit of changing its face without warning. His ships were lost, his trade collapsed, and the family that had once lived in elegance found itself reduced to plain rooms and necessary labor. Of all his daughters, the youngest bore hardship with the most grace. Because of her goodness and calm mind, she was called Beauty. While her sisters complained of their changed condition, Beauty learned to work quietly, and in losing luxury, she seemed only to gain a clearer light within herself. One day, word reached the merchant that one of his ships might yet have returned, and so he set out in hope. Before he left, his daughters asked for presents. The elder girls demanded dresses, jewels, and ornaments, as though fortune had never truly abandoned them. Beauty asked only for a rose. It was winter, and she knew such a gift might be difficult to find, but its simplicity matched her nature. The journey brought disappointment, not restoration, and the merchant turned homeward through cold and darkness with nothing to show for his hope, except the memory of one humble request he still wished to fulfill. Lost in a winter forest and nearly frozen, the merchant came suddenly upon a castle, shining with impossible light. No servants greeted him, yet food was laid out. A fire burned warmly, and a bed stood ready as though the house itself had taken pity on him. He ate, slept, and in the morning wandered through splendid halls without meeting a soul. Then, in a garden bright even in winter, he saw a single rose bush. Remembering beauty, he plucked one blossom. At once, the air changed. A terrible roar split the silence, and the master of the castle stepped forth, a beast, vast, sorrowful, and enraged. The beast accused the merchant not of eating his food or warming himself by his fire, but of taking what had been most loved in the garden. For the rose, the beast said, a life must be paid. The merchant fell to his knees and spoke of his children, of his poverty, and of the daughter for whom he had plucked the flower. The beast listened, and instead of killing him at once, offered a grim bargain. The merchant might return home, but if one of his daughters came willingly to the castle in his place, the debt would be accepted. So the father rode back, carrying the rose like a sentence. When the merchant told his story, grief fell over the house like a storm. The elder sisters wept noisily, though their tears held as much fear for themselves as sorrow for Beauty. Beauty alone understood at once what must be done. Her father had suffered enough, and she would not let him return to certain death. She chose to go in his place, not with theatrical courage, but with quiet certainty. They rode together back through the forest, father and daughter both heavy with dread. Yet Beauty's fear was not the same as despair. Something in her nature refused to believe that kindness could ever be wholly lost, even in a place guarded by a monster. At the castle, the merchant was sent away, and Beauty remained. She expected cruelty, yet found none. Her chamber was richer than any room she had known before. Books and music waited for her, and every meal appeared as if by magic. The castle was silent but not hostile. When the beast came, he spoke awkwardly, even timidly, asking only whether Beauty had come of her own free will. She answered yes. Though her voice trembled, the beast did not threaten her. Instead, he said that she was mistress of the house and might walk where she pleased. So fear remained, but it had been complicated by something harder to name: surprise. Each evening, the beast visited Beauty at supper. His appearance was still dreadful: great paws, coarse fur, and a voice like distant thunder. Yet his manner held none of the violence his shape seemed to promise. He asked if she was afraid. He listened when she spoke. He let silence settle without anger. Still, every night before leaving, he asked the same question in a plain and wounded tone. Would Beauty marry him? And every night she answered no. The refusal never made him furious. He only sighed deeply and withdrew. In time, Beauty learned that gentleness may exist in an ugly body, just as vanity may flourish in beautiful faces. Days passed in comfort, and then in something close to peace. Beauty read, played music, wandered through the gardens, and came to know the beast as a companion rather than a threat. He was not clever in the polished way of courtiers, but he was honest, patient, and incapable of cruelty toward her. She began to pity his sadness and to wonder what sorrow had made such loneliness dwell inside those vast walls. Fear softened into affection before she realized it had changed. She still could not say she loved him, yet his presence no longer darkened her hours. Instead, his absence began quietly to do so. One night, Beauty dreamed that her father lay ill and calling for her. Distressed, she asked the beast if she might return home for a short visit. The beast hesitated, and the room seemed to grow colder around his silence. At last he agreed, but only if she promised to return within a week. He told her more plainly than ever before that without her, he would die of grief. Beauty was moved, though still she did not fully understand her own heart. She left the castle carrying the beast's generosity with her, and a strange heaviness that did not lift even when she saw her father again. Beauty's father rejoiced at her coming, and for a few days happiness seemed simple. But her sisters, astonished by the fine clothes and prosperity that now surrounded Beauty, grew jealous. They praised her, delayed her, and persuaded her to stay a little longer, knowing that the beast had asked for her return. Beauty allowed herself to linger. It was not malice that kept her, only the human weakness of postponing pain. Then, after the promised week had passed, she dreamed of the beast lying alone in the garden, collapsed beside the rose bushes. She woke with such anguish that all hesitation vanished at once. When Beauty returned to the castle, no supper awaited her, and no great figure came slowly to the table. She ran through the silent halls and out into the garden. There, beside the roses, lay the beast stretched upon the ground, like something already halfway lost to life. He had not raged at her delay, he had simply grieved. Beauty fell beside him and wept, calling him dear friend, begging him not to die, telling him that she had been blind to the truth of her own heart. If he lived, she said, she would marry him gladly. In speaking the words, she understood that they were no sacrifice. They were love. At Beauty's confession, the night itself seemed to change. The beast vanished, and in his place lay a prince, restored by the breaking of an old enchantment. He told her that he had once been proud and had been condemned to wear a monstrous form until someone could see past it and love him truly. Beauty had done what courts, appearances, and flattery never could. She had recognized the human heart hidden under terror. So the castle that had been lonely became full of life, and Beauty's tale reached its true ending, not in the triumph of prettiness, but in the reward of clear seeing. For the deepest magic in the story is not transformation, but understanding. Long ago, in a cold northern city where winter seemed to linger at every rooftop, there lived two children who loved each other dearly. The boy was named Kay, and the girl was named Gerda. Their homes were small and poor, tucked beneath the sloping roofs, yet their windows stood so close that they could speak to one another as if they shared a single room. Between the windows, their families had placed little wooden boxes filled with rose bushes. In summer, the roses glowed red and sweet. In winter, snow covered everything in white silence, but the friendship between Kay and Gerda remained warm and bright. On winter evenings, when the wind rattled the eaves and the streets below disappeared beneath drifting snow, Kay and Gerda would sit together and read by candlelight. Sometimes they listened to stories, and sometimes they simply watched the snowflakes turning outside the glass. Gerda's grandmother would tell them that no two snowflakes were ever truly alike, and that each one carried a secret design from the sky. The children would smile and imagine distant kingdoms of ice, crystal palaces, and roads that shone beneath the moon. To them, winter was not yet cruel. It was mysterious, beautiful, and full of wonder. But far away, before Kay and Gerda were old enough to understand sorrow, a strange and terrible thing had happened. There existed a mirror made by a cruel spirit, and that mirror twisted everything good and lovely into something ugly and false. Kind faces looked foolish in it. Flowers seemed withered. Joy itself appeared ridiculous. One day, the mirror shattered high above the world, and its countless fragments flew across the earth like dust in a storm. Some lodged in human eyes, so that beauty could no longer be seen. Others slipped into human hearts, where warmth slowly hardened into coldness. One snowy afternoon, While Kay and Gerda were gazing at frost patterns and laughing together beside the window, Kay suddenly cried out and pressed his hand to his face. He said it felt as if a grain of sand, or perhaps a sharp needle, had pierced his eye. Gerda leaned close to help him, but she could see nothing there. Yet something unseen had indeed entered him. A splinter from the wicked mirror had flown into Kay's eye, and another into his heart. From that moment on, a quiet change began. The light in his gaze shifted, and the gentleness in him started to fade. It did not take long for the change to show. Kay, who had once been tender and cheerful, now laughed at things that were kind and beautiful. He mocked what he had once loved. When Gerda showed him a blooming rose, he said it was crooked and spoiled. Then he tore the flower apart and threw it down. Gerda stood speechless, her eyes filling with tears, unable to understand why her dearest friend had grown so sharp and distant. Day by day, Kay became colder in word and manner, and though he still sat beside her at times, it felt as if he were already moving somewhere far away. That winter arrived early and harsher than any the city remembered. The square filled with children and sleds, and Kay often tied his little sledge behind larger ones, just to feel the thrilling rush across the ice. One day, amid swirling snow and pale afternoon light, he noticed a magnificent sleigh entirely white. It glided almost silently through the storm. Seated within it was a tall woman, beautiful in a way that was both regal and frightening. Her garments shimmered like fresh snow beneath moonlight, and her eyes shone with a cold brightness no fire could soften. It was the Snow Queen. At first, Kay could only stare, as though he were looking into a dream made of ice. The white sleigh slowed, and the Snow Queen turned toward him with a silent command. Kay stepped closer without resistance. She wrapped him in a fur mantle white as frost and lifted him into the sleigh beside her. Then she kissed him lightly on the forehead. The cold of it reached deep into his bones. After the second kiss, his fear began to vanish. After the third, he forgot everything he had left behind. His home, the roses by the window, and even little Gerda. From that day on, Kay did not return. Some said he must have fallen into the river. Others whispered that he had been lost in the winter woods. But Gerda would not believe that he was gone forever. She remembered the last look in his face, strange though it had become, and she could not let go of him. Every morning she ran to the riverbank and called his name into the cold. Every night she pressed her cheek against the empty window and looked at the silent rose boxes below. There, in the stillness of winter, she made a promise to herself. No matter how far she must go, she would find Kay. When spring finally came and the ice broke apart upon the river, Gerda decided that waiting was no longer enough. If the river had taken Kay from her, then perhaps the river could also lead her to him. She climbed into a small boat tied near the shore, believing only that she must begin. The rope slipped loose, and the current drew her gently away. Alone upon the water, Gerda felt fear and courage rise together in her heart. Green buds trembled along the riverbanks, and above her the sky shone clear and wide. So began the first quiet stretch of her long journey. The river carried Gerda to a marvelous garden where flowers bloomed in every season, and golden light seemed to rest forever upon the leaves. There lived an old woman with a soft smile who welcomed Gerda kindly, fed her ripe fruit, and laid her down on a comfortable bed. Everything there was peaceful, sweet, and strangely soothing. Yet the garden held a quiet enchantment. The old woman did not wish to harm the child, but she wished to keep her, and so, by gentle magic, the memory of why Gerda had come began to blur, as though her sorrow were sinking beneath petals and sunlight. For many days Gerda wandered among flowers and warmth, almost as if winter had never existed. But one morning she stopped and noticed something deeply wrong. In that rich and shining garden, there were no roses. The moment she thought of roses, memory returned like a bell sounding through mist. She saw the narrow attic windows, the red blossoms between them, and Kay's face beside her. Then Gerda wept. Her tears fell to the earth, and where they touched the ground, a rose bush sprang up as if answering her grief. At once she understood. She had forgotten, and she must not forget again. Gerda left the garden and traveled onward across fields and lonely roads. Along the way, she met a clever black crow who told her that a young man had recently arrived at the palace of a wise princess, and that he might perhaps be the very boy she was seeking. Hope flared alive again. With the crow as her guide, Gerda entered the palace and passed through quiet corridors lit by soft lamps and guarded doors. But when she at last saw the sleeping young man, she knew at once that it was not Kay. The hope that had lifted her heart fell silent again, though it did not die. Though she had not found Kay, Gerda was treated with great kindness. The prince and princess listened to her story with pity and respect. They gave her warm clothing, gloves, and a small carriage so that she might continue more safely across the cold and distant lands ahead. They knew the world beyond their palace was wide, and that winter in the north could be merciless. Yet they also saw that this little girl carried something stronger than comfort or fear. She carried a faithful heart, and so Gerda set out once more, still sorrowful, yet strengthened by the mercy of strangers. But the road did not remain gentle. Passing through a dark forest, Gerda was captured by robbers and dragged into their rough and fire-lit camp. Surrounded by harsh voices, knives, and staring eyes, she clung to the last of her courage. Yet among them was a wild little robber girl, who for all her roughness was moved by Gerda's story. She understood loneliness in her own fierce way. In the end, it was this strange child who chose to help her. She set Gerda free, gave her food and furs, and sent her onward upon a strong reindeer who knew the frozen lands of the far north. The reindeer ran like the wind over endless snow. Together they crossed frozen plains, lonely settlements glowing faintly in the dark, and vast fields of ice where the air itself seemed sharp enough to break. Gerda shivered beneath her furs, but she held on and kept her eyes fixed ahead. Above them, the northern lights unfurled across the heavens in silent ribbons of green fire. It was as though the whole sky were watching her journey. The farther north they went, the more the world seemed stripped down to ice, breath, and faith alone. Still, Gerda did not turn back. At last, Gerda reached the Snow Queen's palace. Before her stood a place more beautiful and more terrible than anything she had imagined. It was built of ice, wind, and pale light, with halls so vast that sound itself seemed to freeze before it could echo. Snow swirled through the chambers like silent sentries. The floor shone like polished mirrors, and not a trace of living warmth could be felt anywhere. In the center of that frozen stillness sat Kay, alone upon a lake of hardened ice, arranging sharp pieces into patterns the Snow Queen had commanded him to solve. When Gerda saw Kay at last, she no longer felt the cold. She ran to him, threw her arms around him, and called his name with all the love she had carried across the world. At first Kay sat motionless, as if her voice could not reach him, but Gerda wept, and her warm tears fell upon his chest. Then the miracle came. The frozen splinter in his heart began to melt. Kay trembled, and slowly the emptiness left his eyes. It was as if he were waking from a long and terrible dream. Little by little he looked at Gerda and truly saw her again. Kay burst into tears, and as he wept, the fragment in his eye was washed away as well. He recognized Gerda, as he had once known her, and understood that she had never abandoned him. Hand in hand, the two children left the frozen palace behind them and began the long journey home. By the time they returned, the world seemed changed, and so did they. They were no longer the same children who had first sat beneath the attic windows. Yet there, beside the little rose boxes, the flowers bloomed once more, and Kay and Gerda understood that even after the longest winter, a faithful heart may still awaken the spring. There was once a prince who wished to marry, but not merely to marry well. He wanted a real princess, a true princess, though what such truth might look like, no one seemed able to say with certainty. So he traveled from one kingdom to another, entering courts bright with chandeliers and polished manners, only to return unsatisfied. Every palace offered beauty. Every noble house offered refinement. Yet something always felt uncertain, as if silk and courtesy might be disguising what could not easily be measured. At last he came home weary, still alone, and no wiser about how truth might ever present itself. Then, one wild night, when rain lashed the windows and thunder rolled over the roofs, a knocking sounded at the palace gate. When the doors were opened, there stood a young woman soaked through by the storm. Water ran from her hair, her dress clung to her, and her shoes were ruined. Yet despite her miserable appearance, she announced with calm dignity that she was a princess. The old king blinked. The prince stared. The queen, however, said very little. She only looked at the stranger with a thoughtful expression, as if some quiet idea had already begun to form in her mind. Now the queen was not easily persuaded by titles spoken at the door, however noble the voice or graceful the posture. If the girl truly was a princess, then perhaps some sign of it would reveal itself. And so, without fuss, without announcement, and with the calm determination that often belongs to older women who have seen much of the world, the queen prepared a test. She ordered one bed in the finest guest chamber to be stripped bare. Then, from a small box, she took out a single pea and placed it upon the bottom board, where no ordinary sleeper would ever notice it at all. Over the pea, the queen placed a mattress, then another, and another still, until 20 mattresses stood in a neat and impossible tower. Upon them she laid 20 feather beds, so that the whole arrangement rose like a cloud built by servants. The chamber looked more like a theatrical invention than a place where anyone might sensibly sleep. Yet the queen seemed satisfied. If the young woman was merely delicate, the bed would be luxuriously comfortable. But if she possessed that mysterious and absurd refinement expected of true royalty, perhaps the smallest discomfort would travel upward through all that softness and find her in the night. The stranger was shown to the guest chamber, where candles trembled in silver holders, and the high bed waited like a strange monument of comfort. She was tired from the storm, too polite to complain, and far too well-bred to ask why such an extraordinary heap of bedding had been prepared for her. So she climbed, carefully and rather awkwardly, into the nest of linen and feathers, while the rain tapped insistently at the window panes. Beneath all that softness, At the very base lay the pea, small and silent, holding within it the fate of the evening's question. The night passed, but not gently. Though the room was warm and the bed impossibly soft to all appearance, the young woman could not sleep. She turned, sighed, shifted again, and woke each time with the feeling that something hard and dreadful lay beneath her. It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet the discomfort persisted with an almost insulting determination. While the palace slept in peace, the storm-brought guest endured a long night of broken rest, bruised patience, and bewildered dignity, as though the bed itself were engaged in some polite but merciless conspiracy against her. In the morning, the queen received the young woman with courtesy and asked, in the mildest tone possible, whether she had slept well. The question seemed innocent enough, but the princess, pale from exhaustion and still too honest to hide her distress, confessed that she had hardly slept at all. Something in the bed, she said, had pressed against her all night so horribly that she was black and blue from it. The prince nearly forgot his breakfast. The king looked amused and astonished. The queen alone remained composed, though inwardly she was already satisfied beyond doubt. For who, after all, but a true princess could possess such extraordinary sensitivity that a pea hidden beneath 20 mattresses and 20 feather beds would disturb her sleep? It was ridiculous, and yet in that ridiculousness, the test had worked perfectly. The queen revealed the pea, and the whole court marveled at the tiny green thing that had accomplished what lineage, jewels, and royal claims could not. The prince, who had spent so long searching for certainty in formal courts and glittering halls, suddenly found it in a rain-soaked stranger and a very small vegetable. The prince no longer doubted. If she could feel the pea, then she must indeed be the true princess he had been seeking, or so the story would forever insist. Yet beneath the fairy tale logic lies a more playful truth. Perhaps what moved him most was not merely the proof itself, but the strange grace with which she had arrived, endured discomfort, and answered honestly the next morning. In any case, relief entered the prince's heart like sunlight after rain. His searching was over. The world, absurd as it often is, had finally decided to reward him with certainty. Once the matter was settled, the palace came swiftly alive with wedding preparations. Tailors measured silk, servants aired ceremonial rooms, florists filled the halls with blossoms, musicians were called. The storm of the previous night seemed already transformed into the beginning of a fortunate legend. Yet the story kept its delicate sense of humor. All this grandeur, all this royal certainty had hinged on the sleepless complaint of one tired young woman and the stubborn presence of a pea. Such are the proportions of fairy tales, where the smallest object may decide the largest future with complete confidence. The court, which had no doubt spent many years performing elegance with great seriousness, now delighted in repeating the tale. They spoke of the guest's refinement. They spoke of the queen's cleverness. They spoke of the prince's happiness. Some likely believed every word exactly as it was told. Others perhaps smiled privately at the extravagance of the whole affair. But no one could deny that the story pleased them. There is a special joy in a test so foolish that only a fairy tale could treat it as wisdom. And that joy fluttered through the palace like bright ribbon in a spring wind. The wedding day arrived clear and bright. Bells rang across the palace court. The prince stood proud and relieved, while the princess, now welcomed without question, moved through the halls with all the dignity expected of her. Light fell upon polished floors, silk sleeves, and smiling faces. Whatever doubts had entered with the storm were gone. In their place stood ceremony, music, and the gentle certainty that fairy tales require. Even the queen, who had arranged the trial with such practical composure, seemed content to let the day belong to happiness rather than logic. And what became of the pea? According to the tale, it was placed in a museum, where it could be seen if no one had stolen it. This final detail is pure Andersen, dry, playful, and just slightly amused by the grandness people assign to trivial things. The pea, which had once been hidden at the bottom of a bed, now became a relic of royal truth. It is hard not to smile at the thought, yet perhaps every kingdom keeps some small object upon which an entire story of certainty has been built. That is why The Princess and the Pea remain so charming. It is not a dark fairy tale, nor a tragic one. It is a light satire dressed in lace and candlelight. It gently mocks the idea that nobility can be measured by impossible delicacy, while at the same time surrendering to the pleasure of the idea completely. We laugh, but we also want the story to be true. We want strange tests, improbable proofs, and happy endings. And so, Andersen gives us all three, wrapped neatly in elegance and mischief. At last, the princess, who could not sleep upon one hidden pea, had every comfort the palace could offer, and no doubt a bed prepared with considerably more honesty. The storm had passed. The strange trial was over. The prince had his answer, the queen had her proof, and the kingdom had a story delicious enough to repeat for generations. Sometimes, fairy tales ask us to survive sorrow. Sometimes they ask us to confront fear. And sometimes, with a lightness rare in Andersen, they ask us simply to enjoy the absurd elegance of a world where sensitivity itself becomes a kind of royal miracle. So ends the tale of the princess, the prince, the queen, and the pea. It is brief, polished, and delightfully unreasonable, yet beneath its humor lies a familiar wish that truth, however hidden, may one day reveal itself clearly. Here, that revelation does not come through battle or sorrow, but through a restless night and an impossible bed. It is a gentler kind of fairy tale, one that smiles rather than mourns. And in that smile, Andersen reminds us that wonder does not always arrive wrapped in darkness. Sometimes it arrives in silk, rain, and the smallest discomfort imaginable. There was once a poor little girl named Karen who had no proper shoes. In summer she went barefoot, and in winter her feet were red with cold. Her mother was dead, and the world had taught her early how sharp stones could feel beneath a child's steps. One day, an old shoemaker's wife made her a rough pair of red shoes from scraps of cloth. They were not fine, but to Karen they seemed beautiful. She wore them even to her mother's funeral, thinking more of their color than of the sorrow she did not yet understand. After the funeral, a rich old lady saw Karen and pitied her. She took the child into her carriage, brought her to a fine house, and gave her clean clothes, food, and a proper bed. Karen's old red shoes were burned because they were considered ugly and unsuitable. She was taught to read, sew, sit politely, and behave like a respectable girl. Yet beneath her gratitude lived a secret hunger for beauty and admiration. She remembered the red shoes not because they were good, but because they had made her feel visible when she had owned almost nothing. One day, Karen saw a princess pass by wearing delicate red Morocco shoes. The shoes shone like berries against the pale street, and everyone turned to look. From that moment, Karen could think of little else. She was no longer satisfied with plain black shoes for church and school. She imagined red leather, fine stitching, and eyes following her wherever she walked. The old lady, whose sight had grown weak, took Karen to buy shoes for her confirmation. Karen saw a red pair in the shop and said nothing about their color. The old lady did not notice. On confirmation day, Karen wore white, as custom required, but beneath her dress gleamed the red shoes. The church was quiet, solemn, and filled with prayers, yet Karen's thoughts kept slipping downward. Were people looking at her shoes? Did they admire them? Did the red leather shine in the aisle? She tried to listen, but vanity whispered more loudly than the pastor. After the service, an old soldier by the door looked at her shoes and said they were pretty dancing shoes. He tapped their soles with his hand, and Karen felt a strange thrill pass through her feet. As Karen left the church, her feet began to move. At first, it seemed like a little step, then a turn, then a faster movement she had not chosen. The old lady called to her, alarmed, and the coachman caught her and lifted her into the carriage. Even inside, her feet continued to twitch and dance beneath her dress. The old lady was frightened and angry. The shoes were taken off and placed in a cupboard, and Karen was warned never to wear them again. But warnings are weak when desire has already learned the shape of a forbidden thing. The old lady became ill, and Karen was expected to stay beside her, grateful and attentive. But there was to be a grand ball in town, and Karen could not stop thinking of music, lights, and the red shoes waiting in the cupboard. She told herself she would only look, only step out for a short time, only return before she was missed. Quietly, she opened the cupboard and put the shoes on again. The moment they touched her feet, she felt both joy and fear. Then she slipped away from the sick room and followed the sound of music. At the ball, the red shoes carried Karen into the dance. People admired her at first, for she moved with startling grace. But soon the dance grew too quick, too wild, too powerful. Karen tried to stop, but the shoes would not obey. They carried her out of the ballroom, down the steps and into the street. She danced past houses, fields, and dark hedges. The night wind struck her face. She cried for help, but her feet only spun faster. What had begun as a wish to be seen had become a force that would not let her rest. The shoes danced Karen to the church. There, before the door, stood an angel in white robes, holding a shining sword. His face was grave, not cruel, and his voice seemed to ring through the stones. He told Karen that she would dance in the red shoes until pride and vanity were burned out of her heart. She would dance through darkness and daylight, through lonely roads and crowded places, until she became a warning to others. Karen screamed and tried to turn away, but the shoes carried her onward, and the church vanished behind her. Days passed in misery. Karen danced through mud, rain, dust, and thorny paths. Her fine dress tore, her hair loosened, and her face grew pale with exhaustion. Then she saw a funeral procession moving slowly along the road. It was the old lady who had taken her in, now being carried to her grave. Karen tried to stop, to kneel, to weep properly at last, but the shoes dragged her past the mourners. She understood then the full cruelty of her choice. She had left kindness behind for vanity, and now even grief was denied a quiet place in her body. At last, Karen danced to the house of the executioner, who lived alone at the edge of the wood. She knocked on the door and begged him not to punish her for a crime, but to free her from the shoes. Her voice shook with terror. She told him she could not enter church, could not pray in peace, could not stop moving long enough to become herself again. The executioner looked at her with sorrow. He understood what she asked, and how terrible the answer would be. Karen closed her eyes while the red shoes danced impatiently beneath her. The executioner did what Karen had begged him to do. The red shoes, still holding the feet that wore them, danced away into the forest, tapping and turning as if nothing human had ever suffered inside them. Karen was left behind, faint and broken, but still alive. The executioner made her wooden feet and crutches, and she began the slow work of moving without beauty, without admiration, and without speed. Every step hurt, yet each painful step belonged to her. For the first time since putting on the shoes, Karen could choose whether to move or remain still. Karen went to the parsonage and asked if she might work as a servant. She did not ask for pity or praise. She only wished to live quietly, learn humility, and be useful. The pastor's family received her, and she worked as well as she could, though every movement reminded her of what pride had cost. On Sundays, when others went to church, Karen longed to join them, but shame held her back. She sat alone with a prayer book, hearing hymns from far away, and wondered whether mercy could reach someone who had danced past every warning. One Sunday, Karen gathered courage and tried to go to church, but as she approached, the red shoes appeared before her, dancing in the path. She recoiled in horror and turned back. Another Sunday, she tried again, and again the shoes came tapping before her, bright and terrible. Karen understood that she could not simply walk into forgiveness as if nothing had happened. Her repentance had to become deeper than fear. She returned to the parsonage and prayed not to be admired, not to be comforted quickly, but to be cleansed of the pride that still trembled inside her. One quiet morning, while Karen sat alone with her prayer book, sunlight filled the little room. The angel appeared again, but now he carried no sword. In his hand was a green branch covered with fresh leaves. His face was still solemn, yet full of compassion. The walls seemed to widen, and Karen heard church bells as if the church itself had come to her. She bowed her head and wept, not from terror, but from relief. She had wanted red shoes to lift her above others. Now she asked only to be gathered into grace. From that day, Karen's heart changed. She no longer dreamed of people turning to look at her. She found peace in small duties, in quiet prayers, and in the kindness she could offer without being praised. The memory of the red shoes did not disappear, but it no longer ruled her. She understood that beauty becomes dangerous when it teaches the soul to worship itself. She also learned that mercy is not the same as forgetting. Mercy is the patient light that enters after truth has done its painful work. In Andersen's tale, Karen's suffering ends not in applause, but in stillness. The church bells ring, the sunlight deepens, and her soul is lifted beyond the room where she had prayed. The red shoes, once bright with vanity, are no longer the center of the story. What remains is a child who lost her way through pride, endured the cost of it, and finally found peace through humility. It is a severe tale, but not an empty one. Its warning is dark, yet its last movement is toward mercy. In a faraway kingdom, the Emperor of China lived in a palace so delicate that visitors held their breath when they entered. Its walls shone like porcelain, its corridors rang softly beneath silk slippers, and every flower in the garden had a little silver bell tied to it, so no one could pass without music following them. Travelers came from many countries to admire the palace, the gardens, and the glittering court. Yet when they returned home and wrote about China, they praised one wonder above all the rest: a small gray nightingale who sang in the forest by the sea. One evening, the emperor opened a book sent from a distant land and found his own kingdom described with great admiration. He smiled at the gardens, nodded at the palace, and then stopped at a sentence that troubled him. It said the nightingale was the finest treasure in all China. The emperor frowned. How could the greatest treasure in his empire be unknown to him? He summoned his courtiers at once. They bowed, trembled, and searched their memories, but no one had heard the bird. The emperor ordered that the nightingale be found before nightfall, or the whole court would lose his favor. The grand officials hurried through halls and gardens, asking scholars, guards, gardeners, and musicians. At last, they found a poor kitchen girl carrying scraps to her sick mother near the sea. She listened to their questions and answered simply that she knew the nightingale well. Every evening when she walked through the forest, the bird sang so sweetly that tears came to her eyes. The courtiers were astonished that such knowledge lived in the kitchen and not among ministers. Still they followed her out of the shining palace, past the silver-belled flowers, and into the shadowed wood. They had not gone far before a cow lowed in a meadow, and one courtier clasped his hands. Surely that was the famous nightingale, he said, a voice of great strength. The kitchen girl shook her head and led them onward. Then frogs croaked in a marsh, and another official praised their charming temple bell tone. Again the girl smiled politely and said they were wrong. The court had spent so long indoors that it had forgotten the living sounds of the world. At last the trees opened toward the sea, and from a branch above them came a song as clear as moonlight on water. There sat the nightingale, small, gray and plain, with no jewel on its breast and no golden cage around it. The courtiers stared in disappointment. Could this modest creature be the wonder praised across the world? But when the bird sang again, all their doubts fell silent. The kitchen girl listened with tears in her eyes. The officials lowered their fans. Even the sea seemed to pause beyond the trees. They invited the nightingale to the palace, promising honor and admiration. The bird answered that its song sounded best among green branches, but it would gladly sing for the emperor. That night the great hall glittered with candles, silk, gold, and porcelain flowers polished to a perfect shine. The nightingale was given a perch near the emperor's throne, and the entire court gathered to judge the strange little guest. At first, there was only silence. Then the nightingale sang. It sang of moonlit woods, fishing boats on dark water, poor mothers waiting by open windows, and all the quiet things no court musician had ever noticed. The emperor listened until tears rose in his eyes. When one tear fell down his cheek, the nightingale knew it had received the highest reward a singer could desire. The emperor was so moved that he offered the nightingale his golden slipper to wear around its neck. The bird declined with gentle dignity. It had already seen tears in the emperor's eyes, and no jewel could be greater than that. Still, the court insisted on honoring it. The nightingale was given a cage, 12 servants, and permission to walk outdoors twice a day, and once at night, each time tied with silk ribbons held by officials. Everyone praised the bird loudly, yet the nightingale began to miss the forest, where no one measured music by rank, ceremony, or applause. One day, a magnificent gift arrived from Japan, an artificial nightingale made of gold, silver, diamonds, and rubies. When wound, it sang one of the real nightingale's melodies with perfect precision. Its tail glittered, its body flashed with jewels, and it never grew tired at the wrong moment. The court was enchanted. The music master praised the machine because its song could be understood completely. There were no surprises, no wild pauses, no living breath. The emperor ordered the two birds to sing together, but the real nightingale's free song and the machine's fixed tune could not truly meet. The mechanical bird was asked to perform again and again. It sang the same beautiful phrase 33 times without complaint, and the court applauded as if repetition proved perfection. During the excitement, the real nightingale slipped through an open window and flew back to the forest. When the emperor learned it was gone, he felt insulted. The courtiers called the living bird ungrateful and praised the artificial one as more reliable. It was placed on a silk cushion beside the imperial bed, and for a time everyone agreed that a jeweled song, safely controlled, was better than a living voice that might choose its own sky. For a whole year, the artificial nightingale sang at banquets, ceremonies, and private evenings. The people learned its tune by heart until fishermen and children could hum it in the streets. But one night, while the emperor listened from his bed, the machine gave a harsh click, whirred unevenly, and fell silent. Watchmakers were summoned with tools as fine as needles. They opened the jeweled body and found its little wheels worn and delicate. It could be repaired, but only partly. From then on, the artificial bird could sing only once a year, and even that was considered risky. Years passed, and the palace grew quieter. The emperor became gravely ill, lying beneath heavy curtains while courtiers whispered in distant rooms. Many had already begun bowing toward the next ruler. The jeweled bird rested nearby, silent on its cushion, beautiful but useless. The emperor felt cold and terribly alone. In the dimness, he saw strange faces gathering around his bed, all the good and evil deeds of his life, looking at him with accusing eyes. He asked for music, for drums, for the golden bird to sing, but no one wound the mechanism, and no song came. Death sat at the emperor's bedside, wearing his crown, holding his sword, and carrying his imperial banner. The room seemed filled with memories the emperor could not command away. He cried for music, because music might drown the voices of judgment. But the palace instruments were far off, the servants were afraid, and the artificial bird remained silent. Then, outside the window, a small shape settled on a branch. The real nightingale had heard of the emperor's sickness. It had flown from the deep forest through the night, not for reward, not from duty, but because a living heart had once answered its song with tears. The nightingale began to sing. It sang softly at first, of quiet graves where roses grow, of fresh wind moving over fields, and of the peace that comes to those who are remembered with love. Death listened. The shadows around the emperor's bed grew still. The bird sang of spring forests, blue water, and the human heart when it is humble enough to hear. One by one, death returned the crown, the sword, and the banner. The emperor's breathing eased. At last, death drifted away through the window, carried by the music he had paused to hear. When morning came, the emperor opened his eyes and found sunlight on the curtains. He was alive, the nightingale still perched by the window. The emperor thanked it and begged it to remain forever, promising jewels, servants, and a place of honor. But the nightingale asked for something wiser: freedom. It would not live in a cage again. It would come when it wished, sing at evening, and tell the emperor what it saw beyond the palace walls: the poor, the sorrowful, the honest, and the forgotten. In this way, the ruler would hear truth carried on music. The courtiers entered quietly, expecting sorrow, ceremony, and a dead ruler. Instead, they found the emperor sitting upright, pale but calm, with the window open to the morning air. They froze in astonishment. He greeted them simply and asked for no grand display. None of them saw the nightingale hidden among the branches outside, and none knew why the emperor's eyes had changed. From that day forward, he listened more carefully to the world beyond his walls. He learned that a kingdom cannot be ruled only by polished floors, jeweled machines, and perfect songs repeated on command. The nightingale never became a possession of the court. It belonged to the forest, the sea wind, the moonlit branches, and all who listened without pride. Yet sometimes, when evening softened the porcelain palace and silver bells stirred among the flowers, the emperor opened his window and waited. Then the little gray bird would sing of what it had seen: joy in humble houses, grief behind closed doors, kindness in places power seldom looked. And the emperor, who had once searched his own kingdom through foreign books, learned to hear his people through the free song of a small bird. In the warm green stillness of summer, on a small country farm bordered by reeds and water, a mother duck sat waiting upon her nest. Around her, the pond glimmered beneath the sun. Dragonflies drifted low over the water, and the world seemed gentle and complete. One by one, the eggs began to crack. Small ducklings tumbled into the light, soft, yellow, and full of life. The farmyard admired them at once, yet one large egg remained unopened, and the mother duck, growing tired and uneasy, wondered why this last child kept the whole world waiting. At last the shell split, and from it came a duckling unlike the others. He was larger, awkward, and covered not in golden down, but in dull gray feathers. The mother duck blinked in surprise. The other ducklings stared. Even the sunlight that had seemed so kind a moment before now fell upon him with a colder honesty. Still, his mother led him toward the water, hoping that once he swam, all would be well. And indeed, he swam beautifully. Yet beauty of movement could not protect him from eyes that had already decided he did not belong. The farmyard was not a gentle place. There, everything strange was quickly noticed, and everything noticed was quickly judged. The hens pecked at him, the ducks pushed past him. Even his brothers and sisters who had hatched beside him wished that he would go away. "He is too large," said one. "Too ugly," said another. Day after day, the little gray duckling lowered his head and wandered from corner to corner, hoping to escape the stares, the sharp beaks, and the laughter. But ridicule followed him like a shadow, and loneliness settled into his heart before he was old enough to understand it. One evening, when the air had turned violet and the farmyard noises were fading into dusk, the duckling could bear it no longer. He slipped through the hedge and fled. Behind him lay the only home he had ever known. Before him stretched open marshes, dark pools, whispering grasses, and an uncertain freedom. He did not know where he was going. He knew only that he could not remain where every face had taught him shame. So he ran and stumbled through the wild reeds beneath the evening sky, carrying nothing with him but fear, hunger, and the desperate hope that somewhere in the wide world there might be a place for him. In the marshland he found wild ducks resting among the reeds. They did not mock him as the farmyard had, yet neither did they welcome him with warmth. They looked him over and said that, ugly though he might be, he was no concern of theirs, so long as he did not ask for too much. It was not kindness, only indifference, but to the duckling it felt almost merciful. For a short while he remained there, half hidden among water and grass, listening to the wind move through the marsh. It was a poor sort of peace, but it was peace all the same. That peace shattered one morning with the crack of gunfire. Hunters came through the reeds, and the sky filled with wings, panic, and falling birds. Dogs rushed through the water, their jaws wet and terrible. The duckling flattened himself into the mud, shaking with fear, certain each moment would be his last. One great dog stopped directly before him, baring its teeth. But after a long, dreadful pause, it turned and ran on. When the danger passed, the duckling did not feel lucky. He felt only smaller than ever. Even death, he thought, had looked at him and found him too poor a prize to take. Cold and exhausted, the duckling wandered until he found shelter in a poor little cottage, where an old woman lived with her cat and her hen. At first he believed he had reached a place of safety, but the cottage had its own narrow laws. The cat valued only what could purr and arch its back. The hen valued only what could lay eggs. When the duckling spoke of water, of wind, and of his longing to swim in open ponds, they laughed at him and called him foolish. Once again he was told that the shape of his heart did not fit the shape of the world around him. So he left the cottage too, and autumn came with a long gray sadness. The leaves curled and fell. The reeds turned brown. The ponds grew colder each day. The duckling drifted through lonely waters and empty fields, belonging nowhere and remembered by no one. Yet something in him still endured. He watched the world carefully, as if beauty might yet reveal a secret he had not understood. The ache of rejection remained, but now it was joined by a quieter endurance. He no longer expected welcome. He simply kept going, because there was nothing else to do. One evening, as the sky burned pale and cold above the water, the duckling heard a sound unlike any he had known before. He looked up and saw a flock of great white birds flying across the fading light. Their wings moved with a grace so pure that it seemed almost sorrowful. They were swans. The duckling had never seen such creatures, yet at the sight of them something stirred deep inside him, a longing too powerful to name. He called out toward them with a cry that surprised even himself. Then they vanished into the distance, leaving wonder behind them like a wound. Winter came hard and merciless. Ice spread across the ponds. Snow buried the fields. To keep from freezing, the duckling had to paddle without rest through a shrinking patch of water. Night after night, the cold closed in around him. At last, he grew too weak to move, and the water froze fast about his body. There he might have died, had a passing farmer not broken the ice and carried him home. But even rescue brought little comfort. Frightened in the noisy house, the duckling flapped wildly among children, buckets, and milk pans before escaping once more into the winter storm. The winter seemed endless, but the duckling endured it somehow. In ditches, under hedges, beside half-frozen streams, he survived by the smallest margin, thin with hunger and worn by the weather. Yet beneath all that hardship, life persisted. The sky slowly softened. The wind lost some of its cruelty. The ice began to loosen its hold. Though he did not know it, the world was making room for change. The duckling, who had spent so long bowing beneath rejection, carried on into spring with no expectation of joy, only the weary instinct to keep living one more day. Then one morning spring returned. The air smelled of wet earth and opening leaves. The water shone clear again. The duckling, no longer small, spread his wings and felt a strength in them that had not been there before. He rose into the air almost without meaning to, startled by his own power, and flew across gardens and bright new fields until he came upon a broad stretch of water where 3 white swans floated beneath blossoming branches. At once, he recognized the noble birds from his autumn dream, and the old longing awakened in him, softer now, but deeper. He knew their beauty. He knew his own long history of rejection, and so, believing he would rather be struck down by such splendid creatures than continue his lonely wandering, he bowed his head and glided toward them. If they attacked him, he would accept it. If they drove him away, it would be no worse than all the other refusals he had endured. But the swans did not turn from him in contempt. They swam closer, serene and unafraid, their bright eyes resting on him not with cruelty, but with recognition. The duckling lowered his gaze to the still water beneath him, and there he saw at last what the world had hidden from him for so long. No gray, awkward outcast stared back. In the clear reflection stood a young swan, white-feathered, graceful, and radiant in the spring light. He had not become beautiful in a single instant. He had been becoming himself all along, through sorrow, winter, and exile. The revelation was so gentle and yet so overwhelming that it felt like waking from an old grief he had mistaken for life itself. The other swans curved their necks around him in welcome. Nearby, children standing beneath the blossoming trees pointed toward the water and cried out that the new swan was the most beautiful of all. Once, such words would have seemed impossible. Now they drifted across the spring air like a blessing too large to hold. He remembered the farmyard, the marsh, the cold, the hunger, and all the cruel laughter that had shaped his solitude. Yet none of it could define him any longer. For the first time, he belonged not by pleading for acceptance, but simply by being what he truly was. And so the creature once mocked as the ugly duckling drifted upon the water in the full light of spring, no longer hiding, no longer ashamed. He was not proud in the cruel way of the farmyard, nor eager for revenge. He was simply grateful and humbled by the strange path that had led him there. That is why Andersen's tale remains so beloved. It does not promise that the world will always be kind. It tells something truer than that. Sometimes the soul survives by carrying an invisible dignity through seasons of rejection until the day comes when it finally sees itself clearly.
It was the last evening of the year. Snow fell quietly over the city, soft at first, then heavier with every passing minute. The streets grew silent as people hurried inside their warm homes. Windows glowed with golden light. Laughter echoed faintly behind closed doors. But out in the cold, a little girl walked alone, barefoot. Her feet were red and numb from the freezing ground. Her thin clothes offered no protection. In her small hands, she carried a bundle of matches. She had not sold a single one all day, not one. And now, the night was getting colder. She dared not go home. Her father would be angry. Without money, there would be no mercy. And even if she returned, what awaited her was no better than the street. The house was cold, the roof broken, the wind creeping through every crack. So she stayed outside. She found a corner between 2 tall buildings where the wind was slightly weaker. She sat down slowly. Her body curled inward, as if trying to protect the last bit of warmth she had left. But the cold was everywhere. Her fingers trembled. She could not feel them anymore. So she took out one match, just one. She struck it gently against the wall, a spark, then a flame, small, fragile, but warm. For a moment the cold disappeared. The flame flickered softly, casting golden light on her face. It felt like sitting beside a warm stove, like being safe, like being home. But then the flame died, and the cold rushed back in. She lit another match. This time the world changed. Before her stood a table, covered with a white cloth. On it, a roasted goose, golden, steaming. The smell filled the air, rich, warm, alive. Her eyes widened. She reached forward slowly, as if afraid the vision might break. The goose seemed to move toward her, as if offering itself, as if it knew her hunger, but suddenly, darkness, gone. The cold returned once again, and her hands were empty. Another match, another flame. Now, she saw a Christmas tree, bigger than any she had ever seen, brighter than the stars above. Thousands of candles glowed softly among its branches. Ornaments shimmered like jewels. It was beautiful, too beautiful. She reached out her hands, trying to touch the light, but the lights rose higher, higher, until they became stars, and the tree was gone. A star fell from the sky. She watched it carefully. Then she remembered something her grandmother once told her. When a star falls, a soul is rising to heaven. She looked up, quietly, softly, wondering who was leaving the world tonight. She struck another match, and this time she saw her grandmother, the only person who had ever loved her. She looked warm, gentle, kind. The girl smiled for the first time that night. "Grandmother," she whispered, "please, take me with you." She knew when the flame went out, her grandmother would disappear, just like everything else, and she could not bear that, not again. So she lit them all, every match she had left. The night burst into light, bright, warm, endless. Her grandmother stood clearly before her now, more real than ever. She opened her arms, and the little girl ran into them. Together, they rose, above the cold, above the darkness, above the world, where there was no hunger, no fear, no pain, only warmth. The next morning, the city woke up. People walked through the streets as they always did, and there, in the corner, they found her, still, quiet, a faint smile on her face. Matches burned beside her. She tried to keep warm, they said, but they did not know. They did not know what she saw. They did not know where she went, and they did not know how close they had been to saving her. Some stories are not meant to comfort us. They are meant to wake us up, because sometimes the quietest suffering is the one we never see.